So here we're going to talk about the different types of hormones. So what were hormones? So hormones were special kinds of chemicals that were secreted from the endocrine system. And the endocrine system, as they're secreted directly into the bloodstream, and they reach a specific type of organ, which is called the target organ, right? So there's different types of hormones. There's three specific types that I want you to know. There's peptide hormones, there are steroid hormones, and there's also tyrosine-derived hormones. So we talk about the peptide hormones or the proteins. So the proteins. These molecules give up majority of the hormones in the endocrine system. So the way they're synthesized is through a process of called protein synthesis, and they generate this in this fashion of being called prohormones. So prohormones need further regulation in order to have the actual function. They need some kind of cleavage. So what's unique about the chemical structure of the proteins? Proteins are hydrophilic. So do you remember what hydrophilic means? So this means water-loving. So if we look at a cell at the bottom here, for example, if you remember, the cell has what kind of membrane? It's called the phospholipid bilayer, right? And that is very composed of what chemicals? Do you remember? It has fats, right? So majority of it is considered a lot of fats. Fats are what? What is the actual physical chemical property of fats? They're very hydrophobic. So they don't like water. So how is it that the proteins come in and create some kind of response on the actual cells? Well, every hormone, in order to trigger some kind of response, requires a receptor. So the protein, the steroids, and the tyrosine-derived hormones, these are all considered ligands, and these ligands need to bind to a specific type of receptor. So in order for a protein to generate a response, it needs a receptor. Where can the receptor be? Well, the receptors in the proteins, because of this hydrophilic nature of the proteins, is on the cell surface. So the receptors are on the cell surface, right? So the receptors for them, specifically here, is on this little surface here. So if there's some kind of protein, for example, insulin wants to come in and bind to this receptor in order to create some kind of secondary response downstream. It needs to bind because it is unable to diffuse through the actual membrane, all right? Proteins are also fast-acting chemicals. They bind immediately, fast-acting, and because of this, they have a very rapid response, right? So proteins, when they bind, as soon as they bind, their reaction is created. Afterwards, it's completely over, all right? So some examples of the types of proteins that are hormones, right? So all of the hormones in your pituitary gland. So if you remember from what we were talking about before, so the flat pig example. Follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, acetylcorticotropin hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, prolactin, growth hormone. These are all the hormones of the endocrine. But there's many, many more. There's so many. Oxytocin, antidiuretic hormone. What else can we think about here? The insulin, glucagon, somatostatin. These are all proteins, hormones that are derived from proteins. All right? Now, the other two type, the next one I want to focus on is steroid hormones. Steroid hormones are lipids. So steroid is a fat. Okay, so if people, my favorite thing is, my brother, bodybuilder guy, he's trying to get big all the time, and he thinks he knows everything about bodybuilding, comes up to me and says, I want to take steroids. I tell him, well, before you know your material, what is a steroid? And he looked at me, I was like, what is it? Is it a carb? Is it a fat? Is it a protein? He looks at me and he says, protein. If anybody ever corrects you on this, they're wrong. A steroid is a fat. And he looked at me, with that face, like, what's going on? What do you mean? You've been lying. The society has been lying to me all along. I thought steroids was a protein, right? But it's not, right? It's a fat. And so just from that perspective, it already put him in a state where he's thinking, okay, maybe I should actually think twice before I go into this different form of use. Anyway, so most steroids, if not all, are derived from cholesterol. So they always tell you having high cholesterol is bad. Well, not at all. It's all relative, right? Cholesterol gives you all your steroid hormones, for example, your testosterone, your estrogen, your progesterone, and it comes from this. So people that try to have very, very low cholesterol diets, well, you're risking of losing this specific metabolite that is responsible for the development of your testosterone. All right? So because they are fats, they are hydrophobic. They are hydrophobic. So we said that proteins are hydrophilic, so they cannot cross the membrane barrier. How do steroids go into the actual cell? So the uniqueness about steroid hormones, you have these little fats, because they are hydrophobic, they can easily cross the lipid bilayer, right? Because you remember, likes dissolve into likes. They share the same chemical properties. And what happens as soon as they enter the actual cell, there are specific nuclear receptors inside the cell that they bind to. And when they bind to these receptors inside the cytoplasm of the cell, they go into the nucleus and generate some kind of gene response. Okay? So this is because of their hydrophobic nature, right? They're also slow to generate these kinds of genetic responses. However, they're long-lasting. Right? And so examples of steroid hormones I mentioned earlier is, for example, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, cortisol. Remember the stress hormone we talked about, right? So these are all examples of steroid hormone. So like progesterone, mineralocorticoids like aldosterone, cortisol, and etc. Right? I just want you to understand the general examples of these. All right. And the final type, this is sort of a hybrid, quote-unquote, type of hormone, which is called the tyrosine-derived hormones. Okay? So they all come from this amino acid. So tyrosine is an amino acid, an essential amino acid. And here, all of the chemicals from all of these hormones that come from these tyrosines come from the actual amino acid tyrosine, right? Right? They are hydrophilic and hydrophobic. They have both of the properties. So there's certain chemicals that are derived from tyrosine, for example, like epinephrine, that are hydrophilic. Whereas other tyrosine-derived hormones like thyroid hormone, thyroxine, that is a hydrophobic chemical, if that makes sense. That's why I said they're sort of like a hybrid version. The uniqueness about these specific hormones is they all are derived from tyrosine, right? So they're both. It's all relative of which one we're looking at specifically. Again, same here. When we come back to the actual actions, depending on what they are, right? Because depending on what they are, when we talk about the actual receptors, they have both receptors, depending on which hormone it is. So, for example, epinephrine, because it's hydrophilic, where would the receptor be? The receptor would be on the cell surface, because it cannot penetrate the lipid bilayer because it's hydrophilic. It doesn't like fats. It likes water. It likes polar molecules. Whereas tyrosine-derived hormones like thyroxine, thyroid hormone, that is hydrophobic, so it doesn't have the receptors on the cell surface, whereas they're actually in the cytoplasm, right? So they have both here. And then finally, examples that we talked about. So I just mentioned a couple: epinephrine, norepinephrine, what else? So these are the the hydrophilic hormones. And then you have tyrosine derived hormones like the T3, T4. These are your thyroid hormones, so thyroxine, triiodine. And these molecules are hydrophobic. So again, just to summarize, you can see that the types of hormones are separated based off of 3 classes, and each of these classes have their own specific binding site, specific action, specific synthesis, and the different types of hormones.